Greg Cowan stood at the departure gate of JFK International Airport, his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showing a man who had conquered every business challenge except the one that mattered most, leaving the woman who made victory meaningful. The Jakarta acquisition represented years of strategic positioning, a $9 billion merger that would cement his place among the global financial elite. But beside him, Dawn Deander radiated a power that made his corporate achievements seem almost insignificant. At 28, Dawn Deander had built her consulting empire from nothing, transforming struggling startups into industry dominators with surgical precision. Her firm commanded fees that made established consulting giants reassess their pricing strategies, and her client waiting list stretched 8 months deep. When she walked into boardrooms, seasoned executives instinctively straightened their spines and sharpened their focus. She didn't need Greg's success to validate her worth. She was building her own legacy, one strategic masterpiece at a time. 12 months, she said, her voice carrying that subtle authority that made Fortune 500 CEOs reconsider their negotiation positions. That's the timeline your legal team provided for the Jakarta integration. Greg nodded, though something in Dawn's tone made him study her face more carefully. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but it was her expression that commanded attention. Other travelers stole glances at her, drawn by magnetism that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with raw, undeniable power. 12 months to secure our financial future, Greg replied, though the words felt hollow. Their financial future had never needed securing. Dawn's consulting firm generated more profit per employee than most Fortune 500 companies, and her expansion into European markets had exceeded every projection by substantial margins. The first boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Greg's private jet waited on the tarmac, equipped with everything necessary to conduct international business from 30,000 feet. But all that impressive technology couldn't bridge the growing distance he felt from the woman whose success increasingly overshadowed his own achievements. Dawn stepped closer, her hand finding his chest where his heart hammered with anxiety he couldn't name. "I've been analyzing the Asian markets," she said quietly, her fingers adjusting his Italian silk tie with movements that seemed both intimate and strategic. "There are opportunities emerging in Singapore and Hong Kong that could revolutionize our entire operational approach." Greg felt his stomach tighten. Dawn wasn't sharing casual observations. She was informing him that his 12-month absence would create expansion opportunities she intended to pursue aggressively. While he chased regulatory approval in Indonesia, she would be building something that might dwarf his billion-dollar acquisition. "Dawn, I need you to know that this Jakarta deal isn't what I want. If there were any alternative—" "But there isn't," she interrupted with a smile that could have powered Manhattan or reduced it to ashes, depending on her intentions. "And we both know you wouldn't choose differently even if alternatives existed. This is who you are, Greg, the man who sees impossible deals and makes them reality. I married that man deliberately." The boarding announcement came again, more insistent. Greg's assistant materialized beside them, managing briefcases and documents with the efficiency that kept his business empire functioning smoothly. The machinery of success demanded constant attention, and it was hungry for his departure. Dawn rose onto her toes, bringing her lips close to his ear. When she spoke, her voice carried intimacy wrapped in steel that could cut diamonds. "While you're conquering Jakarta's regulatory framework, I'll be conquering everything else. Don't expect to return to the same world you're leaving behind." Before Greg could process the implications of that statement, Dawn kissed him. Not the gentle goodbye of a worried wife, but something far more complex. A kiss that tasted like promises and challenges, like passion and competition combined into something that would either sustain him across continents or drive him mad with longing. When she pulled away, Dawn's expression had shifted into the focused intensity Greg recognized from her most crucial negotiations. She was already thinking beyond this moment, planning strategies in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. "Go build your empire, Mr. Cowan," she said, stepping back with fluid grace that drew admiring glances from every man within visual range. "And try to keep pace with mine." Greg moved through the boarding process like a sleepwalker, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Through the aircraft's porthole windows, he watched Dawn walk across the terminal concourse. She didn't look back, didn't wave, didn't perform any of the emotional rituals expected of wives sending husbands into temporary exile. Instead, she pulled out her phone and immediately launched into what appeared to be a high-stakes business call. As the plane began taxiing toward takeoff, Greg caught a final glimpse of Dawn through the terminal's glass walls. She sat in the VIP lounge, surrounded by laptops and documents, conducting what looked like an impromptu strategy session with executives who had apparently flown in from multiple continents just to meet with her. The aircraft lifted off, carrying Greg toward his destiny in Jakarta. But his mind remained anchored to the image of Dawn in that lounge, not waiting, not mourning his departure, not marking time until his return, building, expanding, preparing to demonstrate what real power looked like when it operated without limitations or apologies. His phone buzzed with a text message. "The view from the penthouse is spectacular tonight, perfect for planning global domination. Safe travels, darling." Attached was a photograph taken from their apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, showing Manhattan sprawling beneath like a kingdom awaiting conquest. But it wasn't the cityscape that made Greg's breath catch. It was Dawn's reflection in the glass, her eyes bright with ambition and something that looked remarkably like liberation. Greg stared at that image as Jakarta grew closer and Dawn grew more distant. He'd spent months planning every detail of the Indonesian venture, analyzing market conditions and regulatory frameworks with obsessive thoroughness. But he hadn't planned for this, the realization that his brilliant, beautiful, dangerous wife might build something more impressive than his $9 billion acquisition while he was away, chasing what he'd considered the deal of their lifetime. The flight attendant offered champagne from his private collection. Greg accepted automatically, his mind processing Dawn's parting words. She'd called him Mr. Cowan, the formal address she used with business rivals and potential acquisitions, not the intimate names they shared in private. As international airspace opened beneath them, Greg began to understand what he'd seen in Dawn's eyes at the airport. Not sadness or resignation, but anticipation. His wife was looking forward to his absence. 12 months of operating without his input, without shared decision-making, without any limitations, except those imposed by her own imagination and ambition. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something uncomfortably close to arousal. Dawn had always been his equal in intelligence and drive, but he'd never seen her completely unleashed. 12 months without him moderating her intensity, without their relationship creating boundaries around her expansion into markets and opportunities he couldn't even envision. Greg raised his champagne glass toward the window where city lights were disappearing into oceanic darkness. "To the woman I left behind," he whispered, "who's probably already planning to make my biggest success look like amateur hour." The aircraft banked eastward, carrying him toward Jakarta and the acquisition that would either secure their financial future or prove irrelevant compared to whatever empire Dawn was preparing to build in his absence. As the lights of home faded beneath the clouds, Greg realized he wasn't just leaving his wife. He was unleashing a force of nature that would reshape everything they'd built together. Chapter 2. Discovery. Power reveals itself in moments when you have every reason to surrender, but choose instead to bend the world to your will. Dawn Deander stood in the marble bathroom of their Manhattan penthouse, staring at the pregnancy test that held the power to rewrite every strategic plan she'd developed for the next decade. 2 pink lines blazed back at her with scientific certainty, announcing the arrival of biological complexity she'd never factored into her expansion projections. 3 months had passed since Greg's departure for Jakarta. 3 months during which she'd systematically demolished every assumption her competitors had made about operating without her husband's partnership. The Yamamoto Industries contract, worth $63 million over 18 months, had required marathon negotiations conducted across 4 time zones. Dawn had secured it during a session that lasted 22 hours. Fueled by determination and increasingly frequent waves of nausea she'd attributed to stress. Now she understood the real source of her body's rebellion. Dawn placed the test on the counter with the same deliberate precision she used when handling explosive merger documents. Her reflection stared back from mirrors that had cost more than most people's annual salaries, Italian craftsmanship, that now showed her a woman whose life had just pivoted in a direction she'd never anticipated. She allowed herself exactly 60 seconds to process the full strategic implications of discovery. Pregnant. The word carried ramifications that extended far beyond biological reality. Board meetings would require strategic modifications. International travel would need careful coordination. The timeline for European expansion would demand complete restructuring. But Dawn Deanda hadn't built a consulting empire by allowing circumstances to dictate her responses. She'd built it by transforming obstacles into opportunities, by identifying advantages where others perceived only limitations. Her phone buzzed against the marble surface. A video call from Kenji Nakamura, her operations director in Tokyo. Dawn checked her appearance, smoothed her silk blouse, and answered with the confident expression that had intimidated corporate boardrooms across 3 continents. Kenji, excellent timing. I've been reviewing the Sakura Group proposal, and I believe we can accelerate their implementation timeline by 8 weeks if we restructure the delivery phases. Kenji's face filled her screen, showing the mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that accompanied major deal negotiations. Dawn-san, the acceleration would require additional consultants from our Singapore and Hong Kong offices. The budget implications will be offset by early completion bonuses built into their contract structure, Dawn finished smoothly. Additionally, this project provides the perfect opportunity to test integration protocols between our Asian offices, something we've been planning since January. As they discussed operational logistics, Dawn found herself calculating different timelines in her mind. Pregnancy typically lasted 40 weeks from conception. Greg's Jakarta deal was projected to conclude in 9 more months, assuming no major complications. If she'd just conceived, the mathematics created interesting strategic possibilities. She could navigate the first 2 trimesters without Greg's knowledge. By the time he returned, she'd have managed the most challenging aspects of pregnancy, while simultaneously expanding her business operations into markets he'd never considered viable. The narrative practically constructed itself, the woman who built an empire while creating life. After ending the Tokyo call, Dawn moved to her home office, a space that rivaled most corporate headquarters in both luxury and technological capability. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of Manhattan, a city she was methodically conquering one strategic victory at a time. Her desk held 3 laptops, 4 tablets, and communication systems that maintained real-time connections to operations spanning 14 countries. She opened her encrypted planning application and created a new project timeline labeled Project Genesis, a codename that carried multiple layers of strategic meaning only she would understand. Week by week, she mapped business objectives alongside pregnancy milestones she'd researched during her lunch break. First trimester. Morning sickness might require modifications to her travel schedule, but video conferencing had evolved sufficiently to maintain her presence in crucial negotiations. She'd focus on consolidating existing operations while her body adapted to its new reality. Second trimester. Historically, the most comfortable phase, according to her research. Perfect timing for the aggressive expansion into South American markets she'd been planning. The São Paulo opportunity alone could generate revenues exceeding 70 million annually. Third trimester, she'd position herself as the strategic architect, directing operations from her perfectly equipped home office, while carefully selected executives handled the physical demands of international travel. Dawn's phone rang. Greg's distinctive tone, carefully chosen classical music that had seemed romantic when they'd selected it together. She allowed 2 rings before answering, using those seconds to shift her mental framework from strategic planner to supportive wife. "Darling, how is Jakarta treating you?" Greg's voice carried exhaustion that seemed to have deepened since their last conversation. "More complicated than anyone projected. Suharto's regulatory team keeps introducing additional requirements, and the political landscape shifts daily. I might need several additional weeks beyond our original timeline." Dawn felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Several additional weeks. He mentioned extending their separation as casually as discussing weather patterns, apparently unconscious that her life wasn't suspended in stasis awaiting his return. "I'm confident you'll navigate whatever complications arise," she said, injecting supportive warmth into her voice. "You always find solutions to impossible situations. What about your end? Did the Nakamura deal finalize?" "Among several others," Dawn replied, allowing satisfaction to color her response. "Kenji and I have been exploring expansion opportunities that could revolutionize our entire Asian operation. The next few months should prove quite transformative." She wasn't lying, merely offering selective truth. Greg made appropriate sounds of encouragement, but Dawn could hear his attention fragmenting toward Indonesian regulatory frameworks and political maneuvering that consumed his focus. They spoke for 12 more minutes, a conversation that felt increasingly performative. Greg described his hotel accommodations and local cuisine, painting pictures of exotic adventure meant to make her feel included in his experience. Dawn responded with carefully edited updates about client meetings and market analysis, sharing enough to maintain connection without revealing the scope of what she was planning. After ending the call, Dawn returned to her expansion planning with renewed intensity. Greg had unconsciously granted her permission to operate independently for weeks beyond their original agreement, weeks that could become months if she managed the situation strategically. She opened a browser window and began researching the most sophisticated prenatal and obstetric care available in Manhattan. If she was going to navigate pregnancy while building an empire, she'd do it with the same methodical excellence she applied to every other challenge. Patricia Chen knocked softly on her office door, a respectful sound that indicated urgent but manageable business. "Come in, Patricia." Patricia entered, carrying a portfolio thick with documents requiring Dawn's review and signature. At 35, Patricia had worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies before Dawn recruited her with an offer that doubled her previous compensation. She possessed the rare combination of absolute discretion and ruthless efficiency that made her invaluable in Dawn's operation. The preliminary contracts from the Rio Consortium arrived this afternoon, Patricia reported, placing the portfolio on Dawn's desk. "Their terms are aggressive, but the revenue projections exceed our most optimistic estimates." Dawn reviewed the contracts, automatically calculating profit margins and risk assessments. The Rio opportunity had appeared unexpectedly, a chance to establish her first South American office with clients who could generate massive returns. 3 months earlier, she might have considered the project too ambitious for their current infrastructure. But 3 months earlier, she hadn't been pregnant. 3 months earlier, she hadn't been operating with the knowledge that she was creating something far more significant than quarterly profits. "Schedule a video conference with their executive team tomorrow morning," Dawn said, approving 3 contracts with her characteristic bold signature. And Patricia, Begin researching office space in Sao Paulo, something that could accommodate permanent operations. Patricia made notes on her tablet, her expression showing only professional interest. But Dawn noticed the slight widening of her assistant's eyes, the barely perceptible pause that indicated Patricia understood the implications of what they were discussing. The Sao Paulo expansion would require substantial initial investment, Patricia observed carefully. Coordinating operations across such distances presents considerable logistical challenges. Dawn smiled with enough confidence to power electrical grids. I've never been particularly intimidated by challenges, Patricia. They tend to resolve themselves when approached with sufficient determination and strategic thinking. As Patricia left to implement the new directives, Dawn placed her hand on her abdomen, where cellular division was occurring with the same relentless energy she applied to business expansion. Greg thought 12 months was sufficient time to conquer Jakarta, but he had no conception of what kind of empire she was planning to build during his absence. The afternoon brought successive video conferences with potential clients across 3 continents. Dawn managed each negotiation while simultaneously calculating pregnancy timelines and expansion schedules, demonstrating the multifaceted thinking that had made her legendary among her legal and financial advisors. By evening, she'd secured 2 additional major contracts, initiated preliminary discussions for South American expansion, and researched prenatal care options that would allow her to maintain her operational schedule without compromising her health or the pregnancy. Dawn stood at her office windows as Manhattan transformed into its nighttime configuration, millions of lights creating a tapestry of ambition and achievement. 30 floors below, people were ending their workdays and transitioning to evening routines. But Dawn's empire operated across time zones that never slept, and her ambitions had never recognized traditional limitations. She opened her secure communication system and composed a message to her attorney. Please prepare documentation for international expansion into South American markets. Timeline aggressive. I want operational capability within 90 days. As she sent the message, Dawn felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the launch of ambitious new ventures. But this time, the excitement was enhanced by the knowledge that she was literally creating the future while building the empire her child would inherit. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her private physician's office. Appointment confirmed for Thursday 10 a.m. Confidentiality protocols in place as requested. Dawn deleted the message and returned her attention to the quarterly projections that would guide the next phase of her expansion. Greg thought he was making sacrifices for their future, but he had no idea that the real future was being constructed through the convergence of biological creation and business domination. Greg thinks 12 months is enough time to change our lives, but he has no conception of the transformation that's already begun. Chapter 3. The Fortress. While others build walls to keep the world out, I construct empires to remind the world exactly who commands it. Dawn Deanda stood at the head of the gleaming conference table. Morning sickness successfully managed. Through a combination of medical intervention and sheer force of will, facing 12 executives who represented the most talented business minds money could recruit. 6 months into Greg's absence, and Dawn had transformed their separation into the most productive period in her company's history. The nausea that had threatened to derail her first trimester had been conquered through the same systematic approach. She applied to hostile takeovers, identify the problem, research solutions, implement controls, dominate the outcome. The Sao Paulo office has exceeded our implementation timeline, announced Marcus Webb, her newly recruited South American operations director. Marcus had been extracted from a prestigious consulting firm through an offer that included equity, participation, and complete autonomy over an entire continent's worth of business development. Our Brazilian partners secured the Mendoza Industries contract 3 weeks ahead of schedule, 74 million over 18 months. Dawn nodded, revealing none of the satisfaction surging through her system. At 24 weeks pregnant, her body had finally adapted to the demands she'd placed upon it, allowing her to operate at full capacity while managing the biological complexity of creating life. The Mendoza contract represented more than revenue. It established her company as a legitimate competitor to consulting giants that had dominated South American markets for decades. Outstanding execution, Marcus. What's our timeline for secondary? Expansion into Buenos Aires and Santiago? 4 months for Buenos Aires, 6 for Santiago, assuming current growth trajectories continue, Marcus replied, consulting his tablet. However, accelerating either timeline would require your direct involvement in initial negotiations. These clients respond to personal relationship building. Dawn felt the familiar thrill of complex challenges, tempered by newfound awareness of physical limitations she'd never previously needed to consider. 6 months ago, she would have boarded a plane within hours, spending weeks in South America laying groundwork through the personal magnetism that had built her reputation. But 6 months ago, she hadn't been managing pregnancy while simultaneously directing business operations across 4 continents. Instead of limitation, Dawn saw opportunity for innovation. Patricia scheduled comprehensive video conferences with both prospect groups, full presentation capabilities, real-time document collaboration, and simultaneous translation services. If we can negotiate the Tokyo expansion remotely, we can certainly handle Argentina and Chile from Manhattan. Patricia Chen, positioned strategically near the conference room's technical equipment, made notes with efficiency that had made her indispensable. I'll coordinate with IT to ensure redundant connectivity and backup communication systems. Should I arrange technical support teams on standby? Technical support, redundant power systems, and complete presentation backup, Dawn confirmed. I want those meetings to function more smoothly than face-to-face negotiations. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison appeared on the main screen from London, her expression radiating the professional enthusiasm that had made her Dawn's most valuable European asset. Speaking of technological innovation, the efficiency protocols we developed have increased London's productivity by 42%. Milan wants immediate implementation, and Frankfurt is requesting modifications for German regulatory requirements. Dawn absorbed this information while discreetly managing another wave of morning sickness through breathing techniques her private physician had taught her. At 24 weeks, these episodes were becoming less frequent, but they still required careful management during crucial business presentations. Elizabeth, how quickly can we implement London's protocols across all European operations? 8 weeks for basic implementation, 12 weeks for full integration, including staff training, Dr. Harrison replied. However, I'd recommend phased rollouts. The system works brilliantly in London's regulatory environment, but requires modifications for different European markets. Dawn calculated timelines automatically, processing how European expansion would align with her pregnancy progression. 12 weeks would place full integration around 36 weeks pregnant, close to full term, requiring careful monitoring but still manageable with proper medical support. Proceed with phased implementation, but compress the timeline where possible. I want complete European integration within 10 weeks. The ambitious timeline created ripples of concern around the conference table. Dawn read the expressions of her senior executives, respect for her vision, combined with worry about resource allocation and operational feasibility. They'd learned to trust her strategic instincts, but this level of expansion typically required the hands-on management style that had built her reputation. James Morrison, her chief financial officer, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Dawn, the resource allocation for such rapid expansion would strain our operational budget significantly. We might need additional financing or moderated growth projections." Dawn smiled at James with the expression she reserved for moments when she was about to demonstrate why others worked for her instead of competing against her. "James, project our revenue for the next fiscal quarter, assuming successful implementation of current expansion plans." James consulted his financial models, his expression shifting as he processed the calculations. "Assuming successful implementation across all markets, gross revenues approaching $300 million with profit margins averaging 39%. And our operational costs, including expanded infrastructure necessary to support that growth, approximately $120 million, including personnel, technology, and facility expenses across all new markets." Dawn leaned back in her ergonomically perfect chair, allowing the mathematics to demonstrate her point, which provides operational profits exceeding $150 million quarterly. "James, I believe we can manage the resource allocation." Silence filled the conference room as her senior staff processed the implications. Dawn had grown accustomed to these moments, the pause that occurred when successful executives suddenly grasped the true scope of her vision. They thought in quarterly terms while she architected generational wealth. Patricia's tablet chimed discreetly. She reviewed the message, then caught Dawn's attention with a subtle gesture. "Greg Cowan is calling from Jakarta. Should I route it to your private line?" Dawn felt complex emotions at her husband's name. 6 months of separation had created strange duality in her thoughts about Greg. Part of her missed him with intensity that sometimes surprised her during quiet moments. But a larger part had grown comfortable operating without his input, making decisions based purely on her own strategic analysis. "Inform him I'm conducting crucial expansion meetings and will return his call within 2 hours," Dawn decided. "Make sure he understands it's important business, not avoidance." As Patricia managed the call deflection, Dawn returned her attention to the expansion planning spread across the conference table. The Jakarta deal that had separated her from Greg was worth $9 billion, impressive by any measure, requiring months of preparation and consuming additional months in implementation. But the empire she was building during his absence generated sustainable revenue streams that could dwarf his one-time acquisition within 24 months. The irony wasn't lost on her. Greg had departed to secure their financial future, unaware that the woman he'd married was constructing a business dynasty that would make his Indonesian success seem modest by comparison. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, covering operational details that would have overwhelmed most chief executives. Dawn absorbed every piece of information, identified potential problems before they could develop into crises, and provided strategic direction that transformed complex challenges into manageable objectives. When her senior staff finally departed, Dawn remained at the conference table, reviewing the organizational charts and timeline projections they'd created together. The empire she was building had acquired momentum beyond her initial expectations, growing and evolving in ways that surprised even her systematic planning. Patricia returned carrying herbal tea, ginger and green tea, a combination that managed pregnancy symptoms while providing necessary caffeine for 14-hour workdays. Greg called twice more during the meeting. He seemed concerned about the delayed callback. Dawn sipped her tea and considered the emotional complexity of her situation. Greg's concern was understandable. They'd established communication patterns during their marriage that emphasized immediate availability. But those patterns had been established when her business operated on smaller scale. when she could manage interruptions without disrupting complex strategic coordination across multiple continents. Schedule a video call for 8 o'clock tonight, Dawn decided. That should be mid-morning in Jakarta, and I'll have completed the European integration proposals by then. As Patricia left to arrange the call, Dawn moved to her office's floor-to-ceiling windows, where Manhattan sprawled 30 stories below, like a kingdom she was systematically conquering. Millions of people navigated their daily routines, most unaware that the woman in this office was reshaping multiple industries across 3 continents. Dawn placed her hand on her abdomen, where her child was developing with the same relentless determination she applied to business expansion. In 6 months, Greg would return to discover a wife who had evolved beyond his recognition and a business empire that dwarfed anything either of them had previously imagined possible. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from her private physician. All indicators optimal. Proceed with regular activities. Next appointment Thursday at 10. Dawn deleted the message and returned her attention to the expansion timelines that would guide the next phase of her empire building. The biological reality of pregnancy was being managed with the same systematic efficiency she applied to international market penetration. Neither would be allowed to limit her potential. The afternoon brought successive video conferences with clients spanning 4 time zones. Dawn managed each negotiation while calculating pregnancy milestones and business objectives in parallel mental tracks. The dual-focus thinking had become second nature, strategic planning intertwined with biological awareness, both progressing toward outcomes that would fundamentally reshape her life. By evening, she'd secured 3 additional major contracts, finalized European integration protocols, and coordinated South American expansion that would establish her company as a dominant force in markets previously controlled by established competitors. Dawn reviewed her achievements during Greg's absence with satisfaction that felt almost physical. While he navigated Indonesian regulatory frameworks, she'd proven that pregnancy enhanced rather than limited strategic thinking. While he aged under political pressure in Jakarta's complex environment, she demonstrated that traditional limitations existed only for women who accepted them. The secure phone line chimed with Greg's punctual evening call. Dawn positioned herself at her desk, surrounded by evidence of the empire she'd built during his absence, prepared to offer carefully edited updates about her progress without revealing the biological reality that would reshape everything they'd built together. While Daddy thinks he's conquering Indonesia, Mommy is building the empire that will make his success look like a practice round. Chapter 4. Complications. True strength reveals itself not in avoiding the storm, but in building skyscrapers while lightning strikes around you. Dawn, Deanda gripped the mahogany edge of her executive desk as another wave of dizziness threatened her carefully maintained composure. The morning sickness that had been manageable during early pregnancy having evolved into hyperemesis gravidarum, a severe condition that could derail everything she'd worked to build. 32 weeks pregnant, and her body had decided to rebel against the punishing schedule she'd maintained since Greg's departure. But Dawn Deanda didn't surrender to biological limitations. She adapted, evolved, and dominated whatever obstacles presented themselves. Patricia, reschedule the Bangkok video conference for this afternoon, Dawn said, her voice steady despite nausea that rolled through her system in persistent waves. And ask Dr. Harrison to take lead on the Munich presentation. I want to review her materials before she goes live with the German clients. Patricia Chen entered carrying the IV equipment that had become part of their morning routine. Dr. Sarah Chen, Patricia's sister, selected for her medical expertise and absolute discretion, had been adamant about severe dehydration not being negotiable. If Dawn insisted on maintaining her operational schedule, she'd require medical support to prevent complications that could threaten both her health and the pregnancy. The board members from Sakura Industries have requested additional consultation about Phase 3 expansion, Patricia reported, efficiently establishing the IV line that would deliver essential nutrients, while Dawn continued directing her global empire. They're questioning our capacity to manage increased scope without your direct oversight in Tokyo. Dawn felt familiar irritation at questions about her capabilities. The Sakura deal represented her masterpiece, a complex negotiation requiring understanding of cultural nuances, regulatory frameworks, and market dynamics across 3 countries. She'd secured their initial contract while managing morning sickness and building an empire. But apparently some clients still doubted her ability to deliver excellence under pressure. Schedule Sakura for tomorrow morning, but clarify that this is strategic consultation, not capability verification, Dawn instructed, settling into her ergonomically designed chair as the IV began its medical intervention. Their concerns about our capacity are noted and dismissed. We've exceeded every performance metric they established during initial contract negotiations. Patricia documented these instructions while monitoring Dawn's vital signs through discrete medical equipment Dr. Chen had installed. The setup resembled a high-tech business hub, but Patricia tracked blood pressure, hydration levels, and stress indicators with medical precision. The communication system chimed with Greg's daily call, arriving with characteristic punctuality. Dawn had grown to anticipate these conversations, with emotions she couldn't entirely untangle. Part relief at hearing his voice, part frustration at the interruption, and increasingly, a strange sense that they occupied different worlds, despite sharing the same planet. "Darling, how are you managing the Singapore expansion?" Greg's voice carried exhaustion that had become his constant companion during 8 months in Jakarta. "Singapore operations launched last week, ahead of schedule and under budget," Dawn replied. Reviewing financial reports Patricia had prepared, local partnerships have secured 3 major contracts, and regulatory approval is progressing faster than our most optimistic projections indicated. What she didn't mention was that Singapore expansion had been accomplished while she battled dehydration so severe that Dr. Chen had threatened hospitalization. What she didn't say was that she'd negotiated regulatory approvals during video conferences where she'd muted her microphone, periodically to manage nausea that would have alarmed any reasonable business partner. That's remarkable. Dawn, I knew you'd handle everything brilliantly. Greg's pride seemed genuine, but Dawn detected something else, surprised that she'd managed such complex operations without his guidance. Jakarta has become more complicated than anyone anticipated. The political environment shifts daily, and we're dealing with factors that weren't in our original assessments. Dawn made appropriate sympathetic sounds while dividing her attention between Greg's challenges and the Rio revenue projections scrolling across her laptop screen. While he'd been navigating Indonesian politics, she'd established operations in 7 new cities, secured contracts worth over $400 million, and built organizational infrastructure that functioned across multiple time zones without requiring her physical presence. "How much longer do you anticipate needing in Jakarta?" she asked, though the question carried implications she didn't voice. "Possibly another 4 months, Greg admitted, and Dawn heard the weight of that timeline in his voice. "I know it's longer than we originally planned, but this acquisition could establish us for life, Dawn. It's worth the extended sacrifice." Dawn felt something cold settle in her chest. 4 more months. Greg was unilaterally extending their separation by 4 months to pursue a deal he considered life-changing, apparently unaware that she was building the life-changing empire he thought he needed to secure for them. "I'm certain you'll make the right decision," she said, injecting warmth into her voice while her mind calculated implications. 4 more months meant she'd be giving birth while he was still away, and he'd return to discover not just her business empire, but also his children, whose existence he remained completely unaware of. After ending the call, Dawn sat quietly processing Greg's extended timeline. Patricia moved efficiently around the office, preparing materials for afternoon meetings while monitoring Dawn's medical indicators with practiced discretion. "The Mendoza Industries contract requires your final approval," Patricia said, placing a leather portfolio on Dawn's desk. "Signing today would secure Buenos Aires expansion and provide exclusive access to their manufacturing partnerships throughout Argentina." Dawn reviewed the contract with focused intensity that had made her legendary among legal advisors. The Mendoza deal represented more than business expansion. It established her company as the dominant consulting force in South American markets, with revenue streams that could generate wealth for decades. But reviewing the implementation requirements, Dawn realized the physical demands involved: site visits to multiple cities, marathon negotiation sessions, regulatory compliance meetings that could extend for days, activities that would become problematic as her pregnancy advanced. Patricia began identifying senior consultants capable of high-level client interface, Dawn decided, signing the Mendoza contract with her characteristic bold signature. People with experience and presence to represent our interests when I might not be physically available. Patricia's expression showed subtle concern. "Are you anticipating extended availability restrictions?" Dawn smiled at her assistant's diplomatic phrasing. Patricia was too professional for direct health inquiries, but too observant to miss patterns emerging in their operational approaches: morning medical sessions, modified meeting schedules, increasing reliance on video conferences over international travel. "I'm anticipating organizational depth," Dawn replied. "The empire we're building must function effectively regardless of any individual's availability, including mine." The afternoon brought successive video conferences with clients across 3 continents. Dawn managed each meeting with commanding presence, but the effort required careful pacing and discreet medical support that would have been impossible in traditional face-to-face negotiations. Dr. Harrison called from London with updates about European integration that was proceeding ahead of schedule, but she'd identified complications with the Frankfurt office requiring Dawn's intervention. German regulatory framework is more complex than anticipated. Their compliance requirements could delay implementation by 8 weeks unless we navigate specific political considerations. Dawn absorbed technical details while managing another pregnancy-related nausea wave. The German situation typically required her personal attention. Sensitive negotiations with regulatory officials who responded better to face-to-face relationship building than remote communication. "What's your assessment if we proceed without addressing Frankfurt complications?" Dawn asked. "We'd forfeit approximately 22 million in potential revenue, and it might impact relationships with other German clients," Dr. Harrison replied. "Significant enough to affect European expansion projections." Dawn weighed options with characteristic precision. $18 million versus health risks of international travel during high-risk pregnancy. Revenue streams versus medical complications that could threaten both business empire and the child developing inside her. Handle Frankfurt through local partnerships, she decided. Identify German consulting firms with established regulatory relationships and structure collaborative agreements. We'll accept reduced profit margins to maintain timeline and avoid operational delays. After the London call ended, Dawn remained at her desk, processing how pregnancy was requiring increasingly strategic adaptations to her business approach. The German situation represented another decision, where she was prioritizing her health and the pregnancy over maximum revenue potential. Patricia entered with the evening medical report Dr. Chen required. Dawn's vital signs had stabilized throughout the day, but stress indicators remained elevated beyond recommended levels. "Dr. Chen wants to discuss medication adjustments," Patricia said carefully. "She's concerned about sustainability of your current schedule." Dawn studied Manhattan's skyline, where millions of people were transitioning from work to evening routines. But Dawn's empire operated across time zones that never slept, and her ambitions had never recognized traditional boundaries. Schedule a consultation with Dr. Chen tomorrow morning, Dawn decided. And Patricia, research the most advanced prenatal care facilities available. I want options that provide medical support without interrupting business operations. As Patricia left to implement these directives, Dawn placed her hand on her abdomen, where the child continued developing with relentless determination that matched her business expansion. Greg thought he was sacrificing for their future, extending his timeline to secure what he considered life-changing wealth, but he had no conception that the woman he'd married was creating life while building an empire that would eclipse anything either of them had previously imagined. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her private physician. Ultrasound indicates twins. Recommend comprehensive examination to confirm and discuss care plan. Dawn stared at the message for several seconds, processing implications that could exponentially complicate every aspect of her strategic planning. Multiples, twins, possibly. The biological complexity she'd been managing was about to become geometrically more challenging. She deleted the message and returned her attention to the quarterly projections that would guide the next phase of her expansion. Whatever biological surprises awaited Discovery, Dawn Deanda would adapt, evolve, and continue building the empire that would establish her family's legacy for generations. 4 more months to prove that creating life and building empires aren't competing priorities, but complementary expressions of the same unstoppable force. Chapter 5. The Birth of Queens. Legends aren't born in comfortable moments. They emerge when the impossible becomes inevitable and pain transforms into unstoppable power. Dawn Deanda felt the first contraction during the most crucial video conference of her career. 38 weeks pregnant and in active labor, while simultaneously presenting a joint venture framework that could generate over $2 billion in revenue across 5 years. 3 screens displayed executives from Sakura Industries, Morrison Holdings, and the Brazilian Ministry of Economic Development, all watching her outline the integrated supply chain model that would revolutionize manufacturing efficiency throughout South America. The coordinated production schedules we're proposing would reduce operational costs by 41% while maintaining quality standards that exceed current industry benchmarks. Dawn continued, her voice steady, despite the tightening sensation across her midsection that announced her children's intention to arrive 4 months ahead of schedule. Patricia Chen sat outside camera range, monitoring both the technical aspects of the presentation and Dawn's increasingly obvious physical distress. They'd established emergency protocols months earlier, subtle communication systems that could address medical concerns without alerting business partners to vulnerability or weakness. Another contraction, stronger this time. Dawn paused to sip water, using the moment to breathe through pain that was announcing her children's readiness to enter the world. She'd researched labor extensively, understood the process and potential complications, but intellectual preparation felt inadequate when confronting the natural progression of full-term childbirth. Ms. Deanda, the implementation phases you've outlined require unprecedented coordination between our organizations, said Hiroshi Tanaka, Sakura Industries' chief executive. Do you have confidence in your company's capacity to manage such complexity? Dawn felt irritation that transcended her current medical situation. Even while negotiating billion-dollar deals, 9 months pregnant and managing a global empire, clients still questioned her capacity to deliver excellence. The casual sexism would have been infuriating under normal circumstances. Today it was insulting. Mr. Tanaka, my company has successfully coordinated complex operations across 6 continents simultaneously, Dawn replied, her tone carrying enough authority to restructure corporate hierarchies. The complexity you're concerned about is precisely why you require our services rather than attempting independent management. The most intense contraction yet gripped her body with force that made her grasp the desk edge. Patricia immediately activated their medical alert system, discreetly contacting Dr. Sarah Chen while maintaining the appearance of normal business operations. Dr. Helena Santos, the Brazilian minister, leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. The economic impact projections are extraordinary. Ms. Deanda, implementation within 18 months could position Brazil as the dominant manufacturing hub for the entire hemisphere. Dawn forced herself to focus, despite increasingly urgent biological signals. Full-term labor carried its own intensity, but she was prepared for whatever challenges arose. What mattered was securing this deal, the capstone achievement that would cement her reputation as the most formidable business strategist of her generation. Dr. Santos, the timeline is ambitious but achievable, provided all parties commit to the resource allocation we've outlined, Dawn said, subtly signaling Patricia to prepare for immediate medical departure. I suggest we finalize preliminary agreements today and schedule implementation coordination for next week. Patricia moved with practiced efficiency, organizing essential documents and electronics Dawn would need to continue operations from whatever medical facility became necessary. They'd rehearsed this scenario, knowing that full-term labor could begin at any moment. Morrison Holdings representative James Liu raised concerns about intellectual property protections and technology transfer agreements. Under normal circumstances, Dawn would have spent an hour addressing his questions with thoroughness that characterized all her negotiations. But normal circumstances didn't include active labor demanding immediate medical attention. Mr. Liu, the intellectual property framework is detailed in Appendix 9 of our proposal documents, Dawn said, standing carefully while maintaining professional composure. My legal team has addressed every concern your preliminary review raised, and we're prepared to implement additional protections as needed. Dr. Chen appeared in Dawn's office with discreet efficiency that made her invaluable during medical situations requiring business continuity. She assessed Dawn's condition through quick, professional evaluation, while Patricia managed the technical aspects of the ongoing video conference. Gentlemen, Dr. Santos, I'm confident we have foundation for extraordinary partnership, Dawn continued, showing no trace of the physical crisis she was managing. Patricia will coordinate final documentation, and I anticipate celebrating our mutual success very soon. The conference ended with enthusiasm and commitment from all parties. Dawn had successfully negotiated a $2 billion deal while in active labor, an achievement that would have seemed impossible if anyone had suggested it months earlier. But as video screens went dark, Dawn assessed the full intensity of her body's demands with the same analytical precision she applied to hostile takeovers. Contractions were arriving every 2 minutes, strong enough to make standing difficult and requiring focused breathing techniques. Hospital now, Dr. Chen said simply, medical training indicating it was time for delivery. The babies are ready to be born. The journey to Mount Sinai Hospital passed in controlled medical urgency. Dawn had researched the finest obstetric facilities in Manhattan, selecting Mount Sinai for their excellent maternity ward and discretion regarding high-profile patients. Full-term labor required immediate medical attention, but this was normal childbirth, not a medical emergency. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the perinatologist Dawn had selected for her expertise in high-risk pregnancies, met them at the emergency entrance. Dawn, ultrasound shows both babies are in optimal position. We can proceed with delivery immediately. Twins, the medical confirmation of what Dawn had suspected based on her symptom severity. Everything looks excellent for full-term twins, Dr. Martinez replied, guiding Dawn toward the delivery room. Both babies appear healthy and ready for birth. As medical personnel prepared Dawn for delivery, her mind continued operating in strategic mode despite the intensity of labor. Greg was 7,000 miles away, completely unaware he was about to become a father of twins. Her business empire was functioning under Patricia's coordination, but major decisions would need her input within days. The timing was challenging but manageable. Anesthesia took effect as Dawn's final conscious thought focused on the irony of her situation. She'd spent months building an empire while secretly creating life, proving that power and pregnancy weren't mutually exclusive. Now she was about to demonstrate that even the intensity of labor couldn't prevent her from achieving the impossible. Dawn opened her eyes in recovery to discover two beautiful miracles sleeping in standard hospital bassinets beside her bed. Her daughter and son, born at 38 weeks, each weighing over 6 pounds and completely healthy. Dr. Martinez appeared with the satisfied expression of a professional who'd just overseen a successful delivery. They're perfect, Dawn. Strong vital signs, excellent respiratory function, and completely healthy full-term twins. Dawn studied her children, marveling at perfect features that would develop into faces she'd love for the rest of her life. Her daughter showed Dawn's determined chin with Greg's lighter complexion. Her son displayed more of Dawn's coloring but facial structure, suggesting his father's bone architecture. Names? The nurse asked, preparing birth certificate documentation. Dawn had researched this decision for months, selecting names reflecting both strength and beauty, power and grace. Amara Deanda Cowan, she said, looking at her daughter. And Kale Deanda Cowan. Amara, eternal, unfading. Kale, mighty warrior. Names that would serve them when they inherited the empire she was building for their future. Patricia appeared with secure communication equipment that would allow Dawn to manage business operations from her hospital room. The Sakura deal is confirmed, she reported quietly. All three parties have signed preliminary agreements, and implementation begins next week. Dawn smiled at the timing. While delivering her children, she'd simultaneously secured the largest business victory of her career. The symbolism was perfect, creating life while building empire, proving traditional limitations existed only for women who accepted them. Her phone buzzed with Greg's daily call. Dawn looked at her sleeping children, then at Patricia, then at the Manhattan skyscape visible through her private room's windows. Tell him I'm managing expanded operations requiring complete attention, Dawn decided. Something about new developments that demand intensive oversight. It wasn't entirely false. The most important expansion of her life had just concluded successfully, and the new arrivals would definitely require intensive attention. But Greg would learn about his children when Dawn determined the timing was strategically optimal. The afternoon brought a succession of video conferences with clients across multiple continents, all conducted from her hospital bed, while medical staff monitored the twins' progress in their advanced incubators. Dawn managed each negotiation with the same commanding presence that had built her empire, proving that even emergency cesarean delivery couldn't diminish her capacity for strategic excellence. Dr. Chen appeared with evening medical reports showing excellent progress for mother and babies. Both twins are thriving, she reported. A standard recovery timeline. You should all be ready for discharge in 2 to 3 days. Dawn processed the timeline automatically. 2 to 3 days meant she'd be home with her children almost immediately, able to establish routines and integrate motherhood with her business operations seamlessly. As evening settled over Manhattan, Dawn reviewed quarterly projections while listening to the soft sounds of her children's breathing in their standard hospital bassinets. The empire she'd built during Greg's absence would continue expanding under Patricia's management. But now it served a different purpose, not just personal achievement, but the foundation of a legacy that would belong to Amara and Kyle. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her attorney. All documentation prepared for trust fund establishment. Await your final approval for implementation." Dawn smiled as she composed her response. "Approved. Begin immediately. The future queens and kings of our empire have arrived. While Daddy builds his billion-dollar deal in Jakarta, Mommy just proved that real power creates life and wealth simultaneously, didn't we, my little revolutionaries?" Chapter 6, Queen of the Boardroom. Power isn't about choosing between priorities. It's about excelling at everything simultaneously, while making it appear effortless. Dawn Deanda adjusted her wireless microphone headset with one hand while supporting 10-week-old Amara against her shoulder, conducting the most crucial video conference of her career with commanding presence that had built her empire. 2 weeks after giving birth, Dawn had returned to work with military precision that made motherhood appear to enhance rather than diminish her capacity for strategic brilliance. Across 4 screens, executives from London, São Paulo, Singapore, and Dubai watched their CEO demonstrate that traditional limitations existed only for women who accepted them. Q3 revenue projections exceed our most optimistic estimates by 53%, Dawn announced, her voice carrying absolute confidence, despite baby Kale sleeping in his designer bassinet just outside camera range. London's efficiency innovations generated cost savings that we're reinvesting into accelerated expansion throughout the European Union and emerging Asian markets. 10 weeks after their arrival, Amara and Kale were thriving perfectly. Both children had been healthy at birth and continued developing normally. More importantly for Dawn's operational concerns, they'd adapted to feeding and sleeping schedules that allowed her to maintain business operations with minimal disruption. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison's image dominated one screen, her expression showing admiration that had become common among Dawn's senior staff. "Dawn, the integration protocols you developed during your strategic planning period have revolutionized our entire operational framework. Milan wants immediate implementation, and Frankfurt is reporting efficiency gains that exceed anything they've achieved in 20 years of consulting." Dawn smiled at Dr. Harrison's diplomatic phrasing. Her senior executives had adapted to their CEO conducting major business while managing infant children, but they maintained professional discretion about the obvious implications of Dawn's expanded responsibilities. "Elizabeth, coordinate with Patricia to schedule implementation conferences for all European offices," Dawn instructed, gently patting Amara's back as the infant settled into comfortable sleep. "I want complete integration within 6 weeks, with performance metrics demonstrating measurable improvement in every operational category." Patricia Chen appeared at the camera's edge, efficiently managing technical aspects of the multi-continent video conference while monitoring both children for signs requiring Dawn's immediate attention. The seamless coordination they'd developed would have impressed professional childcare specialists. Marcus Webb's face filled another screen as he reported from São Paulo. "The Mendoza Industries partnership is generating revenue streams, exceeding our projections by 71%. They want to expand collaboration into Chile, Colombia, and Peru, which could add another 120 million in annual contracts." Dawn felt familiar satisfaction accompanying news of successful expansion, but her response was tempered by new complexity. International travel to oversee Chilean, Colombian, and Peruvian operations would have been automatic months earlier. Now it required coordination with pediatric schedules and medical considerations that hadn't existed in her previous strategic planning. Marcus developed preliminary frameworks for Andean expansion, but structure them around partnerships with established local firms, Dawn decided, shifting Amara to a more comfortable position while maintaining professional demeanor. "I want maximum revenue generation with minimal requirement for direct oversight from Manhattan." The adaptation represented evolution, from a CEO who managed through personal presence to a strategic visionary who built systems capable of independent function. Pregnancy had forced her to develop operational frameworks actually more sophisticated than her previous hands-on approach. James Morrison called from Singapore with updates about Asian market penetration that exceeded every projection Dawn had established. Regulatory approval has been expedited beyond anything we anticipated. We're looking at full operational status 8 weeks ahead of schedule, with client contracts secured for the first 24 months of operation. Dawn nodded approvingly, while discreetly checking on Kale, who was stirring with movements that preceded feeding time. Her maternal instincts had developed with remarkable speed, allowing her to anticipate her children's needs while maintaining focus on business operations spanning multiple time zones. James, coordinate with London to establish shared protocols between European and Asian operations, she instructed. The efficiency gains Elizabeth achieved should be adaptable to Singapore's regulatory environment. I want both regions benefiting from integrated best practices. The 90-minute conference covered operational details across 6 countries, revenue projections exceeding $600 million annually, and strategic planning that would establish Dawn's company as the dominant force in global consulting markets. Throughout the meeting, she managed both children with efficiency that made motherhood appear seamless rather than challenging. After ending the video conference, Dawn settled into the custom-designed nursing chair Patricia had installed, Italian leather upholstery combined with ergonomic support that allowed feeding the twins while reviewing financial documents or conducting phone negotiations. The setup epitomized Dawn's approach to integrating motherhood with empire building, luxury and functionality in perfect balance. Amara latched immediately, tiny fingers gripping Dawn's silk blouse with determination reminiscent of hostile takeover negotiations. The peaceful moment was interrupted by Dawn's secure phone line displaying Greg's international number with persistent insistence that characterized his daily communication attempts. Dawn had been managing Greg's calls strategically for 10 weeks, allowing Patricia to handle deflection with explanations about expanded operations and crucial client meetings. The strategy provided time to determine how to reveal his children's existence while maintaining her strategic advantage. Today felt different. Today, Dawn was ready to control the narrative. Patricia, transfer Greg's call to my private line, Dawn said, ensuring Amara was positioned outside camera range while keeping Kael's bassinet discreetly placed where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Greg's face filled, her screen with exhaustion that had characterized his constant companion during Jakarta negotiations. 12 months into what was supposed to be straightforward acquisition, and the deal had evolved into economic warfare between competing international interests. Dawn, finally, Greg said, relief obvious despite video compression flattening emotional nuances. I've been worried. Patricia keeps explaining crucial meetings, but 10 weeks without real conversation feels excessive, even for your schedule. Dawn studied her husband's face, noting weight loss and stress lines that hadn't existed when he departed for Jakarta. While she'd been building empire and creating life, Greg had been aging under pressure, clearly taking physical toll. Business has required intensive attention, Dawn replied smoothly, adjusting position so Amara remained hidden while continuing to nurse. The expansion opportunities we discussed have accelerated beyond anything I originally projected. That's incredible news, Greg said, though Dawn detected something resembling concern beneath his enthusiasm. But Dawn, you sound different. Tired, maybe? Are you taking care of yourself? The question carried implications Greg couldn't possibly understand. Taking care of herself now meant managing nutritional requirements of breastfeeding twins, while simultaneously overseeing business operations generating millions of dollars weekly. It meant coordinating pediatric appointments with international video conferences, balancing infant sleep schedules with market analysis across multiple time zones. "I'm managing everything that matters," Dawn said, unconsciously echoing confidence that had sustained her through pregnancy complications, premature labor, and integration of motherhood with empire building. "Our Jakarta development's progressing." Greg launched into detailed explanation of regulatory complications and political challenges, extending his timeline indefinitely. As he spoke, Dawn calculated mathematics of revelation. Greg's return was now imminent according to his latest projections, meaning the twins would be exactly 2.5 months old when he arrived home. "Greg, what if Jakarta timeline extends beyond current projections?" Dawn asked, phrasing carefully to sound like concern rather than strategic planning. "It's possible," Greg admitted, frustration obvious despite digital compression. "Political situation is more volatile than anticipated, and walking away now would forfeit 22 months of preparation and investment." Dawn felt something resembling sympathy for her husband's position, complicated by growing realization that their separation was serving purposes neither had anticipated. Greg's extended absence had allowed her to establish motherhood and business integration without his input or interference. His return would require renegotiating every aspect of their relationship. "Do whatever's necessary in Jakarta," Dawn said finally. "I have everything completely under control here." After ending the call, Dawn looked down at Amara, who had finished nursing and was studying her mother's face with intense focus that characterized both twins. Kyle stirred in his bassinet, making sounds indicating he'd be ready for feeding within minutes. Patricia knocked discreetly before entering with afternoon schedules. 3 more video conferences across different continents, contract reviews requiring Dawn's signature, and strategic planning documents for next quarter's expansion initiatives. The Hong Kong Consortium requested additional meetings about Phase 2 implementation, Patricia reported, efficiently organizing materials Dawn would need. "They're impressed with preliminary results and want to accelerate timeline." Dawn shifted Amara to her shoulder for burping while mentally calculating logistics of managing feeding, schedules around international business meetings. The complexity would have overwhelmed most executives, but Dawn had discovered motherhood enhanced rather than diminished her capacity for systematic thinking. "Schedule Hong Kong for tomorrow morning, but build flexibility for interruptions," Dawn instructed. "And Patricia, research the most sophisticated childcare support systems available. I want options providing professional assistance without interfering with my direct parenting involvement." As Patricia left to implement directives, Dawn settled Kale against her chest for his feeding while reviewing quarterly financial projections on her tablet. The numbers were staggering. Her company was generating revenue, establishing it among the fastest-growing consulting firms in corporate history. But the truly remarkable achievement transcended financial success. Dawn had proven traditional limitations existed only for women who accepted them. She was demonstrating that motherhood and empire building weren't competing priorities, but complementary aspects of the same driving force. The afternoon brought successive international calls, each managed while caring for her children with seamless integration that would have impressed efficiency experts. Dawn had discovered that the systematic thinking required for successful parenting actually enhanced her business decision-making, forcing absolute precision in priority assessment and time management. As evening approached, Dawn reflected on the empire she'd built during Greg's absence. The revenue projections, international expansion, and operational innovations represented unprecedented success. But the real achievement was personal. She'd proven that creating life while building wealth wasn't just possible, but natural for women who refused to accept artificial limitations. While Daddy thinks he's chasing the deal of a lifetime in Jakarta, Mommy is showing the world what real power looks like when it refuses to make excuses for existing. Isn't that right, my little revolutionaries? Chapter 7. The Reckoning Approaches. Some storms announce themselves with thunder, while others arrive on scheduled flights carrying the weight of long overdue reckoning. Dawn Deander stood at her office's floor-to-ceiling windows, 2.5-month-old. Amara sleeping peacefully in her arms, while 2.5-month-old Kale occupied the designer playpen that had become permanent furniture in the room where she conducted multi-million-dollar negotiations. Manhattan sprawled beneath her like a kingdom systematically conquered through strategic victories. But today, her attention focused on the international departure screen she'd been monitoring systematically for the past week. Greg's flight from Jakarta was scheduled to arrive in 7 hours, exactly 12 months. That's how long her husband had been absent from their life, pursuing a deal he'd considered essential for their future, while remaining completely unaware that Dawn had built an empire and created their children during his absence. The mathematical precision would have been amusing if the implications weren't so profound for everything they'd built together. "Patricia, confirm final arrangements for this evening," Dawn said, her voice carrying controlled precision that had sustained her through pregnancy complications, premature labor, and integration of motherhood with global business operations. "I want every detail managed flawlessly." Patricia Chen appeared beside Dawn's desk, tablet in hand, managing complex logistics that would transform this ordinary Tuesday into the most significant day of their marriage. "The penthouse has been prepared according to your specifications. Catering arrives at 7:30, the children's areas have been discreetly arranged, and security has been briefed about maintaining privacy during what might be an emotionally complex evening." Dawn nodded, though her mind remained focused on strategic elements of what was about to unfold. Greg expected to return to the life he'd left 12 months earlier, a successful marriage with a brilliant wife who'd managed their affairs during his absence. He had no conception that the woman waiting for him had evolved beyond recognition, or that their family had expanded in ways that would fundamentally alter every assumption he'd made about their future. The secure phone line chimed with an incoming call from Dr. Elizabeth Harrison in London. Dawn shifted Amara to a more comfortable position and accepted the video connection, her professional demeanor automatically engaging despite personal preoccupations. "Dawn, European integration has exceeded every projection we established," Dr. Harrison reported. "Enthusiasm obvious despite early morning hour in London. Efficiency gains from your operational frameworks have generated cost savings being reinvested into accelerated expansion throughout the continent. Milan, Frankfurt, Barcelona, and now Rome are all requesting immediate implementation." Dawn smiled at the report, though satisfaction was tempered by knowledge that Greg would learn about these achievements secondhand. After 12 months of absence, during which she'd accomplished more than either had thought possible. "Elizabeth, prepare comprehensive documentation of all European achievements. Performance metrics, revenue increases, client satisfaction ratings, and expansion timelines. I want everything quantified and ready for presentation." "Presentation to whom?" Dr. Harrison asked, though her expression suggested she suspected the answer. "To someone who's been absent from our operations long enough to require complete briefings about what his wife accomplished while he was pursuing Indonesian regulatory approvals." After ending the London call, Dawn returned to her position at the windows, watching Manhattan's afternoon traffic flow through streets that seemed almost too small to contain the ambitions she'd realized during Greg's absence. Amara stirred against her shoulder, making sounds indicating she'd be ready for feeding within minutes. Dawn had orchestrated everything with military precision. Greg's flight would land at 5:15. Customs and ground transportation would deliver him to their building by 7 o'clock, assuming no delays. She'd arranged for him to believe she was conducting crucial business meetings until 8:30. Providing time for final preparations and one last feeding cycle for both children. The plan wasn't complicated, but its execution would determine how the most important relationship in her life evolved during coming months. Greg would enter their penthouse expecting romantic reunion with the wife he'd married. Instead, he'd discover that Dawn Deander had become something unprecedented, a mother and CEO whose achievements during his absence dwarfed anything either had previously accomplished. Marcus. Webb's face appeared on another screen, calling from Sao Paulo with updates that would have thrilled her 12 months earlier, but now felt routine given the scale of success she'd grown accustomed to managing. Dawn, Chilean and Colombian expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule. Peruvian regulatory approval came through this morning. We're looking at operational status within 5 weeks, with revenue projections that could add another 80 million annually. Dawn absorbed information while simultaneously checking Kale's diaper and calculating feeding schedules that would need to accommodate evening revelations. The multitasking had become second nature, business strategy intertwined with maternal instincts, both operating at levels that would have seemed impossible before necessity forced her to develop capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Marcus. Excellent execution on South American expansion, Dawn replied, settling into her nursing chair as Amara indicated readiness for feeding. Patricia will coordinate with you about documentation for tonight's presentations. I want every achievement from the past 12 months compiled and ready for comprehensive review. The afternoon continued with succession of international calls, each providing updates about business operations that had flourished during Greg's absence. Dawn managed every conversation while simultaneously caring for her children, demonstrating seamless integration of motherhood and empire building that had become her signature achievement. At 5:30, Patricia began implementing final preparations that would transform their penthouse into setting appropriate for revelations that would reshape two lives forever. The children's items were arranged with strategic subtlety, obvious to anyone looking for them, but positioned so they wouldn't dominate the space or create immediate shock upon entry. Dawn moved through evening routines with systematic precision, nursing both children and ensuring they were comfortable for what might be lengthy and emotionally complex evening. She'd selected her outfit with same care she applied to crucial business presentations, elegant enough to remind Greg of the woman he'd married, practical enough to accommodate infant care, and powerful enough to establish that she remained absolutely in control of whatever followed. At 7:45, Patricia appeared in the nursery where Dawn was conducting final preparations. Greg's car just entered the building's garage. Security estimates he'll reach the penthouse in approximately 12 minutes. Dawn felt her heart rate increase for the first time since delivering the twins. Business negotiations never affected her this way. She'd confronted hostile corporate raiders and international regulatory officials without experiencing the adrenaline surge now flooding her system. But those confrontations had involved only money and market share. Tonight involved everything that mattered. She positioned both children in the custom-designed nursery area adjoining their main living space, arranged so they'd be visible but not immediately obvious to someone entering the penthouse. Amara and Kale settled peacefully, their sleep schedules perfectly timed to allow Dawn maximum flexibility during coming hours. The elevator chimed, announcing Greg's arrival on their private floor. Dawn positioned herself in the living room's seating area, surrounded by quarterly reports and expansion plans documenting her achievements during his absence. She'd arranged materials with calculated precision, impressive but not overwhelming. Accessible but requiring explanation. The door opened, and Greg Cowan stepped into a life that had evolved beyond his recognition, while he'd been pursuing what he'd considered their financial salvation. Dawn? His voice carried exhaustion and relief in equal measure. 12 months of separation compressed into single word that held every emotion he'd suppressed during their forced separation. Dawn rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving toward the husband she'd married and the stranger he'd become during their extended separation. Greg looked older, worn down by months of pressure and political maneuvering in environments that had tested every aspect of his business acumen. But as he stepped deeper into their home, Dawn watched the exact moment when Greg's expectations collided with reality. His eyes registered business documents scattered across their coffee table, subtle modifications to their living space, and finally, the unmistakable sound of infant movement from the adjacent nursery. Greg's face cycled through expressions Dawn observed with clinical fascination, confusion, disbelief, and finally, shocking comprehension, as implications of what he was seeing penetrated his travel-exhausted consciousness. Dawn. His voice had changed completely, carrying questions she wasn't yet ready to answer. What exactly has been happening here while I was away? Dawn smiled at her husband, with expression combining love and challenge, in proportions that would determine everything about their future together. Welcome home, darling. I think it's time you learned what real power accomplishes when it refuses to wait for permission to exist. Chapter 8. The Shock. Truth has its own gravitational force. The larger the revelation, the more violently it reshapes everything in its orbit. Greg Cowan stood frozen in his own doorway, luggage abandoned at his feet, staring at the woman who wore his wife's face but radiated energy he didn't recognize. 12 months of separation had transformed Dawn in ways his exhausted mind struggled to process. But the unmistakable sound of infant crying from their bedroom shattered his ability to maintain rational thought. Dawn. His voice cracked on her name. 12 months of longing and confusion compressed into syllables that carried the weight of questions he wasn't prepared to ask. Please tell me I'm hallucinating from jet lag and chronic sleep deprivation. Dawn. Deanda rose from the Italian leather sofa with movements that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign, still graceful, still commanding, but carrying confidence that appeared to have crystallized into something approaching invincibility during his absence. She wore a silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but it was her expression that made Greg's breath catch in his throat. She looked like a woman who had conquered the world while he was gone. You're not hallucinating, Greg, Dawn said, her voice carrying subtle authority that had always made boardrooms fall silent. Though I imagine reality might feel surreal for the next several minutes. The infant crying intensified, joined by a second voice that made Greg's knees threaten to buckle. 2 babies, 2 separate, distinct voices expressing dissatisfaction with something occurring in what had been their private bedroom 12 months earlier. 2. Greg managed, his business-trained mind automatically processing data even while his emotional center reeled from implications he couldn't yet comprehend. Dawn, there are 2 babies crying in our bedroom. Yes, she replied simply, making no move to address the crying or offer explanations that might help Greg maintain his sanity. There are. Dawn moved toward the nursery with fluid precision, leaving Greg standing in their living room, surrounded by financial documents and expansion plans that seemed to cover every available surface. As she disappeared from view, he heard her voice speaking in tones he'd never heard before. Soft, soothing, infinitely gentle sounds that seemed to calm whatever crisis was occurring beyond his line of sight. Greg's mind raced through calculations that refused to make sense. 12 months ago, Dawn had been neither pregnant nor showing signs of expecting children. 12 months ago, they'd been focused on careers and financial opportunities that had taken him to Jakarta. 12 months ago, his wife had kissed him goodbye at the airport without mentioning anything about planning to expand their family during his absence. The crying stopped, replaced by Dawn's voice, speaking to someone in terms that seemed both businesslike and affectionate. Yes, I know you're hungry, beautiful girl, but Daddy just arrived home, and we need to manage this introduction carefully. Kale, sweetheart, your timing is impeccable as always. Daddy. The word hit Greg's consciousness like physical blow, carrying implications that reorganized every assumption he'd made about his life during the past 12 months. Dawn had given birth to his children, apparently two of them, while he'd been negotiating regulatory frameworks and political complications in Indonesia. Dawn reappeared carrying a tiny infant whose perfect features made Greg's throat constrict with emotions he had no framework for managing. Behind her, he could see into the nursery that had somehow materialized in their bedroom, complete with cribs, medical equipment, and everything necessary to support two very small human beings. "Greg Cowan," Dawn said, her voice carrying formal precision that seemed appropriate for international treaty negotiations. "Meet your daughter, Amara Deanda Cowan." Greg stared at the infant in Dawn's arms, his mind struggling to process the reality of parenthood, arriving without warning or preparation. Amara was tiny but perfect, with features blending Dawn's bone structure with what might have been his own coloring. She studied him with dark eyes that appeared far too intelligent for someone who couldn't possibly be more than a few months old. "How long?" Greg asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. 2 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, Dawn replied with characteristic precision. They were born healthy at full term, and both have thrived from day one. Greg felt something resembling the ground shifting beneath his assumptions. 2.5 months. Dawn had been managing infants for 2.5 months, while he'd been focused on Indonesian business regulations and political maneuvering. She'd navigated labor, delivery, and early parenting without his knowledge or support. "And the other baby?" he managed to ask. Dawn moved toward the nursery, returning moments later with a second infant whose features showed more of her coloring but facial structure remarkably similar to Greg's own baby pictures. "Kyle Deanda Cowan, your son." The formal introduction felt surreal, as if Dawn was presenting business partners rather than the children Greg had never known existed. But as she held both infants with practiced ease, Greg began understanding that his wife had evolved into something he'd never imagined. Possible, a mother whose confidence in that role appeared as absolute as her confidence in every other aspect of her life. "Dawn," Greg's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "Why didn't you tell me?" 12 months of phone calls, video conferences, daily communication. "Why didn't you mention that you were pregnant?" Dawn's expression shifted into something that reminded Greg of her most challenging business negotiations, patient but implacable, willing to explain her position, but not apologize for decisions she'd made based on information he hadn't possessed. "I tried to tell you, Greg, multiple times during the first trimester, but you were always too busy, too distracted, too focused on Jakarta's regulatory complications to listen when I said I had important news." Greg's memory scrambled through 12 months of international phone calls, searching for moments when Dawn might have attempted to share life-changing information. He found them, conversations where she'd seemed to be building towards something significant before his attention drifted to Indonesian political developments or regulatory framework modifications. "You could have insisted," he said, though the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "I could have," Dawn agreed, adjusting both infants with practiced efficiency that spoke of months of experience he'd missed entirely. "But I chose instead to handle the situation independently, which, as it turns out, was the correct strategic decision." Greg looked around their living room, finally noticing details his shock had initially obscured. The business documents scattered across every surface weren't random paperwork. They were quarterly reports, expansion plans, and revenue projections showing numbers that exceeded anything they'd previously achieved. Dawn hadn't just managed pregnancy and early parenthood during his absence. She'd simultaneously built something approaching a business empire. "The company," he said, picking up a financial report showing quarterly profits exceeding $120 million. "Dawn, these numbers, how is this possible?" "Turns out, pregnancy enhances rather than limits strategic thinking," she replied, settling into her nursing chair with movements suggesting this routine had been established for months. Who knew that creating life while building an empire would prove to be complementary activities? Greg sank into the nearest chair, his luggage still abandoned by the door, his mind struggling to process the scope of what Dawn had accomplished during their separation. The woman he'd married had been brilliant and ambitious, but the woman sitting across from him had achieved something that redefined his understanding of what was possible for any single person to accomplish. São Paulo office generated $93 million in revenue during Q3, Dawn continued, beginning to nurse Amara with casual efficiency that made motherhood appear effortless. European integration created cost savings that we reinvested into Asian expansion, and Singapore operations secured regulatory approval 8 weeks ahead of schedule. Each piece of information hit Greg like separate revelation. While he'd been fighting Indonesian bureaucrats for control over a $9 billion acquisition, Dawn had been creating sustainable revenue streams that could generate wealth for generations. While he'd been aging under pressure in Jakarta's political environment, she'd been proving that traditional limitations existed only for people who accepted them. "The Jakarta deal," Greg said finally, his voice carrying exhaustion that had accumulated over 12 months of separation. $9 billion, Dawn, the largest acquisition in our company's history. Everything we've worked toward for the past 5 years. Dawn looked at him, with expression combining affection with something that might have been pity. "Greg, darling, my company generated $360 million in profit during the past 12 months. At current growth trajectories, we'll exceed your Jakarta acquisition's total value within 24 months of sustainable operation." The mathematics hit Greg like physical blow. Dawn's empire wasn't just successful, it was generating returns that made his 12-month sacrifice seem modest by comparison. While he'd been pursuing what he'd considered the deal of their lifetime, she'd been building something far more valuable and infinitely more sustainable. "How?" he asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to understand the full extent of what he'd missed. "By refusing to accept limitations that other people tried to impose on my potential," Dawn replied, shifting Kyle to her other arm with movements that spoke of months of practice. "Pregnancy didn't slow me down. It motivated me to prove that women could excel at everything simultaneously. Premature labor didn't derail my expansion plans. It taught me to build systems that could function independently of my physical presence." Greg stared at his wife, finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd married had used his absence to evolve into something unprecedented. She'd become a mother and CEO whose achievements during 12 months exceeded what most people accomplished during entire careers. "I missed everything," he said, words carrying weight of recognition that felt close to grief. The entire pregnancy, their birth, their first 2.5 months, the business expansion. "I missed everything that defined this year of our lives." "You chose Jakarta over everything that mattered," Dawn corrected gently, though her tone carried steel wrapped in silk. "I simply chose not to let your absence prevent me from accomplishing what needed to be done." Infant Kyle began fussing, making sounds suggesting he'd be ready for feeding within minutes. Dawn handled the situation with systematic precision, positioning both children so she could manage their needs while continuing the conversation that was reshaping Greg's understanding of his own life. "What happens now?" Greg asked, looking around their transformed home. The nursery equipment, business documents, and evidence of Dawn's expanded operations created a landscape he didn't recognize despite living there for 3 years. Before his departure, Dawn smiled at him with expression, holding love and challenge in proportions that would determine everything about their future together. "That depends entirely on whether you're prepared to live with the woman I've become, or whether you were more comfortable with the woman you thought you'd married." Greg looked at his wife nursing their son while simultaneously reviewing financial projections that documented business achievements beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Dawn Deander had spent 12 months proving she could excel at everything while making it appear effortless. But the real question wasn't about her capabilities. It was about whether he could evolve quickly enough to deserve a place in the empire she'd built. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he admitted, words carrying honesty that felt both devastating and necessary. "Then I suggest you begin learning quickly, because the woman who waited patiently for your return died sometime around the second trimester, and the woman sitting here now doesn't have time for regret or recrimination." Chapter 9, The Price of Absence. Forgiveness isn't a gift you receive, it's a privilege you earn through proving you understand the true cost of your choices. Dawn, Deanda watched her husband pace their living room like a caged predator, his mind clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered during his first 10 days home from Jakarta. Each day had revealed new layers of the empire Dawn had built during his absence, new evidence of the life he'd missed while pursuing what he'd considered their financial salvation. The medical bills alone total over $200,000, Greg said, holding documentation Patricia had compiled at Dawn's request. "Dawn, you handled labor, delivery, and months of newborn care without ever mentioning financial stress during our calls." Dawn adjusted 2.5-month-old Amara against her shoulder while simultaneously reviewing quarterly projections on her tablet, the multitasking that had become second nature during Greg's absence. She'd specifically requested that Patricia compile every medical expense, every insurance claim, every moment of crisis that Greg had missed while negotiating Indonesian regulatory frameworks. "I didn't mention financial stress because there wasn't any," Dawn replied, her voice carrying matter-of-fact precision that characterized all her business communications. "My company's quarterly profits exceeded those medical expenses by approximately $90 million. Greg, the bills were handled the same day they arrived." Greg stopped pacing, his expression showing mixture of awe and something approaching devastation that had characterized his emotional state since discovering the scope of Dawn's achievements. "You paid for everything yourself. Medical care, nursery equipment, specialized consultants, round-the-clock nursing support. Everything. I paid for everything because I was the only parent present when our children required care," Dawn said simply. "Just as I made every medical decision, attended every appointment, and navigated every crisis that arose during their first months of life." The statement hit Greg like physical blow, though Dawn hadn't intended cruelty, merely accuracy. The mathematical reality of parenthood was that someone had to be present for feeding schedules, medical emergencies, and developmental milestones. Greg had been 8,000 miles away, focused on acquisitions that now seemed almost trivial compared to what Dawn had accomplished. Patricia. Jen appeared in the doorway carrying secure communication equipment that allowed Dawn to conduct international business from their penthouse nursery. "The London office is requesting video conference approval for the Rome expansion proposal," she reported. "Dr. Harrison believes the timeline could be accelerated if we implement the Barcelona protocols she developed last month." "Schedule London for this afternoon," Dawn instructed, automatically calculating how timing would align with Cale's feeding schedule. "Ask Dr. Harrison to prepare comparison data showing European efficiency gains versus South American operational improvements." Greg watched this exchange, with expressions shifting between admiration and something resembling loss. During his first 10 days home, he'd observed dozens of similar interactions, Dawn managing global business operations while simultaneously caring for infants whose existence he was still adjusting to comprehend. "I could help," he said after Patricia left to coordinate the London conference. "With the children, I mean. And maybe with some business operations, if you need additional support." Dawn looked at her husband with patient expression she reserved for well-meaning but ultimately inadequate suggestions. "Greg," Amara cries when you hold her. "Kyle becomes fussy whenever you attempt feeding. They don't know you, because you weren't here during the months when infant bonding occurs." The words were delivered without malice, but their impact was devastating nonetheless. Greg had spent 10 days attempting to integrate into routines Dawn had established over 10 weeks of single parenting, and the results had been uniformly awkward. His children didn't recognize his voice, didn't respond to his attempts at comfort, and seemed to prefer their mother's handling in every situation. "They could learn to know me," Greg said, though his voice carried uncertainty that undermined the assertion. "Children adapt, don't they? If I spent more time with them?" "Of course they could learn to know you," Dawn agreed, settling Cale into his feeding position with practiced efficiency that spoke of months of experience. "But Greg, adaptation requires consistency and presence, two qualities your business commitments haven't traditionally prioritized." Greg felt weight of that assessment settle over him like physical burden. Dawn's observation was accurate but painful. His career had always demanded travel, irregular hours, and attention that could be redirected at short notice toward whatever opportunity required immediate focus. The secure phone line chimed with incoming call from Marcus Webb in São Paulo. Dawn accepted the connection automatically, her attention shifting seamlessly between infant care and business strategy in ways that made both activities appear effortless. "Dawn, Colombian and Peruvian expansion exceeded every projection we established," Marcus reported. Enthusiasm obvious despite video compression. "Regulatory approval came through ahead of schedule, and we've secured preliminary contracts worth over 90 million annually." "Excellent execution, Marcus," Dawn replied, adjusting Cale's position while simultaneously processing information that represented more revenue than most companies generated during entire fiscal years. "Coordinate with Patricia about implementation timelines, and prepare documentation for the comprehensive review we discussed." Greg listened to this exchange while calculating numbers that made his Jakarta acquisition seem almost modest by comparison. During 12 months of absence, Dawn had created sustainable revenue streams across multiple continents, while simultaneously managing the most challenging aspects of early parenthood. After ending the São Paulo call, Dawn returned her attention to Greg, with expressions combining love with assessment that felt uncomfortably clinical. "You want to help with the children and the business, but Greg, both require commitments your lifestyle hasn't historically accommodated." "My lifestyle could change," Greg said, though even as he spoke the words, his phone buzzed with messages from Jakarta indicating the acquisition required additional oversight to prevent regulatory complications that could jeopardize the entire deal. Dawn noticed his distraction, her expression shifting into something that reminded Greg of her most challenging business negotiations. "Your phone has buzzed constantly since you arrived home 10 days ago. Each interruption lasted an average of 22 minutes, during which your attention was entirely focused on Indonesian political developments, rather than the family you claim you want to prioritize." Greg looked down at his phone, realizing Dawn's assessment was mathematically accurate. Despite his intentions to focus on reconnecting with his wife and meeting his children, Jakarta continued demanding his attention with relentless insistence that characterized all major acquisitions. "The Jakarta deal is almost complete," he said, though the word sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Once the regulatory framework is finalized—" "Greg," Dawn interrupted, her voice carrying authority that made international executives reconsider their negotiation strategies. "The Jakarta deal will never be complete. There will always be additional regulatory requirements, political complications, or market conditions requiring your attention. That's the nature of complex acquisitions." Greg felt something resembling the ground shifting beneath his assumptions about how their life would resume after his return. He'd imagined coming home to the woman he'd married, perhaps with adjustments necessary due to expanded business operations, but fundamentally the same relationship they'd maintained for 3 years before his departure. Instead, he'd discovered Dawn Deanda had evolved into something unprecedented, a woman who had proven traditional limitations existed only for people who accepted them, who had simultaneously created life and built an empire while he was absent, chasing what he'd considered their financial future. "What do you want from me?" Greg asked, the question carrying exhaustion and confusion in equal measure. Dawn smiled at him with expression holding affection wrapped in steel that could cut diamonds. "I want you to decide whether you're prepared to be the husband and father this family requires, or whether you're more committed to business opportunities that will always promise to be more important than anything happening at home." As if summoned by their conversation, both children began fussing simultaneously, Amara requiring diaper change and Kyle indicating readiness for his afternoon feeding. Dawn handled both situations with systematic precision that made Greg feel superfluous in his own home. "I can learn," he said, watching his wife manage complex infant care while simultaneously monitoring stock market reports on her tablet. "Dawn, I know I missed everything important, but I can learn to be what you need me to be." Dawn paused in her activities, looking at Greg with expression carrying assessment and something that might have been hope, tempered by realistic expectations about human nature and established behavioral patterns. Learning requires prioritizing the lesson above everything else. "Greg, are you prepared to make our children more important than Indonesian regulatory frameworks? Are you willing to make our marriage more important than whatever acquisition opportunity arrives next?" Greg opened his mouth to respond with assurances and commitments, but his phone buzzed again with messages from Jakarta that automatically drew his attention. When he looked up, Dawn was watching him, with expressions suggesting his reaction had answered her questions more definitively than any words could have managed. The afternoon brought additional revelations about the scope of Dawn's achievements during his absence. Financial reports showing quarterly profits that exceeded most Fortune 500 companies. International expansion that had established her firm as a dominant force in global consulting markets. Operational innovations that competitors were already attempting to reverse engineer. But the most staggering revelation was personal. Dawn had created a trust fund for the twins that would provide generational wealth regardless of any future business developments. She'd established educational accounts, healthcare provisions, and security measures that would protect their children through any possible economic scenario. "You've thought of everything," Greg said, reviewing documents that demonstrated planning far beyond what either of them had previously considered. "Dawn, this level of preparation, it's like you were planning for my permanent absence." Dawn's expression didn't change as she responded. "I was planning for every possible scenario, Greg, including the possibility that the man who returned from Jakarta might not be the same person who left 12 months ago." As evening settled over Manhattan, Greg found himself confronting the mathematical reality of his choices. He'd sacrificed 12 months of his family's life to pursue a $9 billion acquisition. During that same 12 months, Dawn had generated sustainable profits exceeding $360 million, while simultaneously creating and nurturing the children he'd never known existed. "Take all the time you need to decide, darling. But understand that the woman who waited patiently for your return no longer exists, and the woman sitting here now has already proven she can build empires without requiring anyone's permission or support." Chapter 10. The Empire They Build Together. Love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about choosing someone worthy of witnessing your power and strong enough to build beside you. 6 months after Greg Cowan's return from Jakarta, Dawn Deanda stood at the head of their expanded conference room, 8.5-month-old Amara exploring toys in her advanced developmental center, while 8.5-month-old Kale demonstrated his newly acquired crawling and sitting skills in the sophisticated play area that had become permanent fixtures in every room where Dawn conducted business. The morning's agenda included presentations from 7 continents, quarterly reviews documenting the most successful period in their company's history, and most importantly, the formal announcement of structural changes that would revolutionize how their combined empire operated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dawn began, her voice carrying confident authority that had built a global consulting empire while simultaneously raising twin infants. "I want to begin today's presentation by introducing my business partner and co-CEO, Greg Cowan." Greg rose from his position at the conference table, his appearance transformed from the exhausted executive who'd returned from Jakarta 6 months earlier. The stress lines had faded, replaced by confidence that came from finally understanding his role in the extraordinary life Dawn had built during his absence. More importantly, he moved with easy competence of a father who had learned to conduct financial analysis while managing infants who had finally learned to smile when he entered a room. "The integration of our operations has exceeded every projection we established when I returned to active partnership 6 months ago," Dawn continued, unconsciously steadying Amara as the infant reached for the laser pointer Dawn used during presentations. "Greg's expertise in large-scale acquisitions has complemented our organic expansion model in ways that have revolutionized our entire strategic approach to Dr. Elizabeth." Harrison appeared on the main screen from London, her expression showing professional admiration and personal affection that characterized Dawn's relationship with her senior staff. "Dawn, European operations have never functioned more efficiently. The systematic protocols Greg developed for managing complex regulatory frameworks have reduced our compliance costs by 52% while accelerating expansion timelines." Greg smiled at Dr. Harrison with genuine warmth, reflecting collaborative relationships he'd built with Dawn's team during the past 6 months. The transition from absent husband to integrated business partner had required humility and systematic learning that challenged every assumption he'd made about leadership and partnership. "Elizabeth, European success has become our template for expansion into markets we'd previously considered too complex for rapid development," Greg replied, automatically retrieving a soft toy that Kyle had thrown while maintaining his professional focus. "African opportunities alone could generate revenue streams exceeding 250 million annually." Patricia Chen, now serving as Chief Operations Officer for their combined empire, provided updates from her position near the children's activity area, seamlessly balancing executive responsibilities with childcare support that allowed both Dawn and Greg to maintain their business focus. "The organizational structure we've implemented allows unprecedented operational flexibility. Dawn manages Asian markets during morning routines, while Greg handles European negotiations during afternoon nap times. The integration had required systematic rethinking of everything about how successful executives balanced professional responsibilities with family commitments. But rather than treating parenthood as limitation on their business capabilities, Dawn and Greg had developed operational frameworks that enhanced their effectiveness by forcing absolute precision in time management and priority assessment. Marcus Webb's face appeared on another screen, calling from São Paulo. "Revenue projections for next fiscal year are extraordinary," he reported. "Combined operations across all continents should exceed $1.5 billion annually, with profit margins establishing us as the most successful consulting operation in corporate history." Dawn felt familiar surge of satisfaction accompanying news of exceptional business performance, but the feeling was enhanced rather than diminished by presence of her children and knowledge that Greg had become a true partner in every aspect of their expanded life. "Marcus, those numbers represent more than financial success," Dawn said, automatically handing Amara a sophisticated educational toy while maintaining eye contact with the video screen. "They prove traditional limitations on working parents exist. only for people who accept them as permanent conditions rather than temporary. Challenges requiring innovative solutions. The video conference continued for 2 hours, covering operational details across 7 continents, strategic planning that would guide expansion for the next decade, and financial projections exceeding what most Fortune 500 companies achieved during peak performance periods. Throughout the meeting, Dawn and Greg managed their children with seamless coordination that made parenthood appear complementary to empire building rather than competitive with business success. After their international team signed off, Dawn and Greg remained in the conference room, reviewing quarterly reports, while Amara and Kale played with educational toys selected by child development specialists who understood that heirs to a global empire required intellectual stimulation from their earliest months. The Jakarta acquisition finally closed last month, Greg said, though his tone suggested the $9 billion deal had become almost secondary to other achievements they'd accomplished together. Full regulatory approval, political complications resolved, and integration proceeding ahead of schedule. Dawn looked at her husband with expression, combining pride in his professional success with amusement at how their priorities had evolved during the past 6 months. That's wonderful news, darling. But I'm more interested in discussing the nursery school proposals Patricia compiled for our review. Greg laughed, a sound that had become common during recent months as he'd learned to find joy in domestic responsibilities he'd never anticipated embracing. The Geneva International School offers programs accommodating our travel schedule, and the Manhattan facility provides advanced language instruction that would give them significant advantages. The conversation about their children's educational future continued while they reviewed business documents documenting their combined success. Dawn's original empire had expanded exponentially with Greg's systematic approach to large-scale operations, while his acquisition expertise had found new applications in the sustainable growth model Dawn had perfected during his absence. Amara began making sounds, indicating she'd be ready for her afternoon snack within minutes. Dawn settled into the feeding area that had become permanent furniture in every room where she conducted business, automatically adjusting her schedule to accommodate biological requirements that had become integral parts of her operational planning. "I've been thinking about the next expansion phase," Greg said, efficiently managing Kyle's snack time while reviewing financial projections on his tablet. Middle Eastern opportunities could be substantial, but they'd require establishing operations in regulatory environments that might be challenging for traditional consulting approaches. Dawn nodded thoughtfully, while preparing Amara's organic fruit portions, her mind processing strategic possibilities that would have seemed impossible before she'd learned to integrate motherhood with empire building. What if we approached Middle Eastern expansion through partnerships with local firms owned by women? Political sensitivity might actually become a competitive advantage if we position ourselves as pioneers in collaborative international development. The strategic discussion continued, while they managed their children's care, demonstrating seamless integration of professional and personal responsibilities that had become their signature achievement. Dawn and Greg had discovered that parenthood enhanced rather than limited their business capabilities by forcing absolute precision in priority assessment and time management. As afternoon transitioned into evening, their penthouse filled with comfortable sounds of a family that had found balance between extraordinary professional success and domestic happiness, most people considered mutually exclusive. Amara and Kale played contentedly, while their parents concluded business calls with clients across multiple time zones. "I never imagined this," Greg said, as they prepared the children for evening routines. "When I left for Jakarta, I thought I was chasing the deal that would secure our future. I had no idea the woman I'd married was capable of building something that would make my biggest success look modest by comparison." Dawn smiled at her husband while settling both children for their bedtime routines, surrounded by evidence of the empire they'd built together. Financial documents showing unprecedented success, photographs of offices across 7 continents, and most importantly, the children who would inherit everything they'd created through refusing to accept traditional limitations on human potential. The empire I built during your absence was impressive, Greg, but the empire we're building together will change how the world thinks about success, power, and the integration of professional achievement with personal fulfillment. As Manhattan sparkled beyond their floor-to-ceiling windows, Dawn Deander and Greg Cowan settled into evening routines, combining responsibilities of global business leadership with joys of raising children who would inherit not just wealth, but a redefined understanding of what human potential could accomplish when supported by love, partnership, and the refusal to accept that anyone must choose between different aspects of a life worth living. While the world told us we had to choose between family and empire, we proved them wrong by building both simultaneously and making it look effortless, didn't we, my little revolutionaries?